Kenny Burgos is the head of the New York Apartment Association, a group representing landlords of buildings with rent-stabilized apartments. So I guess you'll understand we're going to talk about the sort of guidance decision by the Rent Guidelines Board, which holds out the possibility that there could be a rent freeze.
I'd be shocked if we didn't.
You'd be shocked?
If we didn't.
But they're holding, is there any wiggle room for landlords to not have a zero rent freeze?
Well, right now they put the preliminary range out, which is 0 to 2% for a 1 year and 0 to 4 for a 2 year. But just this fact that they would put a 0 in the range is shocking in and of itself, because nothing in their data would even warrant a 0%. Neither would it warrant a rent freeze, but it does seem the politics is presiding more than the data.
But in fact, the mayor said that as a condition of getting elected, that he would impose a rent freeze. So he appointed people to the board who seem leaning towards a rent freeze. You know, you could understand where tenants could be excited about the fact that they're not going to have to pay any more to live in their apartments. Why is that a good idea or a bad idea?
Totally understand why a tenant would want that. I wouldn't argue that, nor would I argue the affordability crisis is very, very real. But putting a blanket rent freeze on a regulated housing stock that has a median rent of $1,500 and is facing double-digit increase in costs on insurance, on property taxes, on water, sewer, labor, this is how you can, and fuel is how you can squeeze the operations and you get these substandard housing conditions. Now, it doesn't mean we don't address affordability. Tenants should be protected and should be helped. Mayor Mamdani is pushing back on the City FEP's voucher expansion. We should be expanding that. That's how you prevent homelessness.
They can't afford City FEPs.
But this is where the government has to help with affordability.
There's no way to afford
But they're
City
pushing
FEPs.
an affordability on the owners who can't afford it as well. This is why owners are going to defer maintenance, go away without repairs. Mayor Mamdani just spent time in this building this week, in a building that had substandard conditions because it's rent stabilized and it's been bankrupted twice.
Look, so we have a situation where you would argue that there are big landlords and small landlords. And I guess you would argue that bigger landlords have more of an ability to absorb a rent freeze. But what about all the small property owners, the people who own smaller buildings, people who live in minority neighborhoods who, you know, maybe rent out 2 rooms?
I actually wouldn't argue that exactly, because if you're a larger building, you have costs that go parabolic, a host of regulations that come in based on the size of your property. But it's to speak to the entire rent stabilization industry. They're all struggling, small and large landlords.
But the reason I asked the question is because there are some who have advanced an argument to the Rent Guidelines Board that you should separate out the buildings, especially small property owners who own buildings that have like 10 apartments.
That was my argument, and it wasn't for small and big. It was because in the rent stabilization system, there are 2 categories that I separate. Pre-1974, which is the majority of the stock, over 800,000 units. And then you have the newer developments, the ones that people see on the affordable housing website, people who voluntarily enter the rent stabilization system and receive a property tax break for it and have $4,000 or $5,000 rents, completely different world. The people I represent, the pre-1974, pay the highest property taxes, have some of the lowest rents, and have to pay all the costs of operating housing. They're the ones being squeezed.
But so you, I'm sure, have gone to the Rent Guidelines Board with statistics to show that your owners are being squeezed and are not making a profit. What are you telling them?
Absolutely. I'm telling them their own data. The Rent Guidelines Board's own data says 10% of the housing stock is in financial distress. That's 100,000 apartments. For comparison, NYCHA has 177,000 apartments. Also, the Rent Guidelines Board's definition of financial distress is literally your rent is below your expenses. I would argue you're in financial distress well before you reach that point. So it's likely 200,000 or 300,000 apartments. And what I'm saying is a rent freeze against that backdrop, against this housing stock that's been struggling, only threatens to put more buildings in financial distress. And how is that pro-tenant to bankrupt a building tenants are living in? Where are their options after that?
So what you're really saying is that if you bankrupt a building, then the conditions get worse.
Absolutely. And this is why we're seeing more violations post the 2019 rent laws that absolutely destroy this housing stock. But on top of that, the Rent Guidelines Board has come in under inflation for a decade. On top of that, we've seen inflation post-COVID. So this housing stock has been struggling well before Mayor Mamdani, but his threat of a rent freeze only threatens to add more distress and to hurt more tenants in this process.
But, you know, there's a whole bunch of empty apartments. Why is that?
Because of the 2019 rent laws. The 2019 rent laws made it so that there are now tens of thousands of apartments that I visit weekly that are sitting empty in the midst of this housing crisis because it is economically unviable to bring them to market.
So we have to talk about the 2019 housing law, because what it did is it made it more difficult for people to flip apartments.
Yeah, no, that law is the reason why this housing stock is devalued, is in financial distress. And it's not a flip. What was happening, that's the way you finance these buildings. Repairs in New York City cost a lot of money. Right now, on average, about $100,000 to get an apartment up to code after a long tenancy. NYCHA spends $400,000 to do this.
$100,000
At a minimum.
For one apartment?
Lead remediation.
But why? What does the $100
Because the city
go for?
council is passing laws almost every single month that add on regulation that you have to abide by when you have turnover. Lead remediation being one of them. It's almost $25,000.
I mean, but like, you can't cost $100,000 to repaint an apartment and make sure that
It's not just repainting.
you have new employment. Well, what do you have to do?
Oh, lead remediation, asbestos, you have to put window guards, you have to sometimes remove the walls. When you're doing lead remediation alone, you're gutting it down to the studs. Tenants live in these apartments typically 20 or 30 years. You take that opportunity on turnover to bring it up to code, to bring it to a new, updated apartment that families actually want to live in.
So how can a landlord afford $100,000 to bring an apartment up to code and keep it on the market?
Today, they can't. That's why you have these empty apartments.
So why is it that people don't understand that, and that the Rent Guidelines Board has turned a deaf ear to your pleas?
Well, the Rent Guidelines Board can't solve that. That's a state law. People don't understand it because it's one of the most complex housing systems in the country, and I don't blame them. This is why I make social media videos, and I'm constantly on media appearances trying to explain how complex this housing is. But at its core, this housing is regulated by the city and the state. It has a median rent of $1,500, and per the Rent Guidelines Board, costs $1,350 per month just to operate. We're not even talking about the cost to invest and renovate the capital improvements. So all that put together, you don't have enough of a rent roll. You can't borrow from a bank. This housing is going to fall apart.
So I have to point out one thing.
Of course.
During the Bill de Blasio years, there was a rent freeze in 2015, another one in 2016, and another one in 2020 during COVID. The city didn't fall apart, and there's still apartments. So if they could do it during de Blasio, why is it so bad to do it during Mayor Mamdani?
Complete different scenario. Like I said, the law changed in 2019. This was the law that changed everything. So a rent freeze in the de Blasio area and a rent freeze today after everything that I just said are two completely different worlds. This housing stock wasn't in this financial scenario in those years in the de Blasio era. Today, the rent got, because the law changed.
You're trying to say it just got worse?
It got tremendously worse, Marcia. We're seeing an increase in violations. The Rent Guidelines Board is showing our reductions in repair and maintenance. We have thousands of units sitting offline. I can show you buildings in the Bronx selling right now for $19,000 per apartment. And that's not an advertisement. That is a warning sign. This housing stock is almost mirroring what we saw in the 70s. There's almost no value in a rent-stabilized building today because there's no path to cover the expenses that are continuing to increase. If you cannot cover your costs, you cannot function. It is as simple as that. And the city keeps increasing the cost, but is capping on the revenue and then wants to freeze on the rent. The law, there's nowhere to release the pressure anymore.
But if you have a situation where you have a building that says, listen, here's the reality. My insurance costs have gone up X%. My fuel costs have gone up X%. Why doesn't the Rent Guidelines Board look at those statistics?
That's my question that I have, Marcia. They
No,
look at all these numbers, they get all its reporting, and they actually produce what's called a commensurate adjustment, which is a percentage base to say this is the number we have to adjust rents to account for all the increase in costs. They do that math. The math this year was 4.5% on a one-year lease. So they do the math, and then they completely ignore it because the politics is what is the pressure that's put on them. So they've done this math already, but now they're putting a 0% increase to 2% on a 1 year. So their range is half of what they say that's needed just to keep these buildings treading water. This is not about an increase in profit. This is just to try and sustain the increased cost. So you have the same question that I have. You have the data, they have the math. Why not follow the math? Why not make this a math equation?
So we have about 15 seconds left. What would you say to them? 15 seconds.
Follow the data. I don't need 15 seconds. Follow the data. The data says it all.
But the thing is, they don't look at it.
They do, and they produce reports. We look at them, we analyze them. They have all these reports. They just are not following them.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it right there for now. But up next, a woman who is using her marketing skills to help stop the spread of anti-Semitism. We are back with Kenny Burgos. Now, I have to point out that you and Mayor Mamdani were assemblymen together in Albany. You were friends.
Yeah, still are.
You're still friends?
Yes.
When was the last time you talked to him?
I talked to him. I was in City Hall last month. We had a meeting with him.
And did you tell him about your concerns?
I've been telling about my concerns since he launched his campaign.
And what does he say to you?
Well, I'm not going to divulge all our personal conversations, but I think he recognized that there's some distress here. But I also recognize that, listen, like he's a politician like I once was too. And when you run on a rent freeze, you really can't back up off of that. But I told him, I said, this housing crisis is so severe, particularly for rent stabilization. And it's not your fault, but you're coming into City Hall at a time when it's under your leadership. And I truly believe if you don't fix this, it can derail his administration.
When you say don't fix this, what are you looking at? What kind of fixes?
Well, the opposite of rent freezes will be a good start. But what I'm saying is that
we say you have to fix the property tax system.
Yes, and to Mayor Mamdani's credit, him and I have had good discussions on property taxes. There's been a recognition on the cost of insurance, and we support his move to try and bring a city-backed insurance program. So he's recognizing the cost increases, but at the same time pushing for a blanket rent freeze.
But so, did you say to him, or did you hint to him or whatever and say, look, if you do this rent freeze, this is what's going to happen to the housing stock? Did you paint it in stark terms, and what are those stark terms?
I painted it in very stark terms, and the stark terms is what I was saying. If you freeze this rent against the backdrop of where this housing is today, you only threaten to destroy more housing. And the city, that I often say, it's not a shot at the hardworking members of the city, but the city doesn't have the cash, the capacity, nor the capability to run housing. They can't run NYCHA right now. They cannot sustain 1 million apartments of rent-stabilized housing. They have to fix this system. They can't keep, trying to intervene in court at every single turn. You will be doing this for 4 years.
You think the mayor gets that?
I think he does.
So what is it going to do? Do a rent freeze for 1 year and then say, okay, I did it, now we're going to go back? I mean, we're talking about a rent freeze that could be in effect for 2 years.
Yeah.
So was he going to say no rent freeze after 2 years?
I can't pretend to speak for the mayor or know what's in his head. Like I said, he campaigned on this. It's very hard to back away from it, and I recognize that. But he has to contend and concede to reality that this housing stock is in deep trouble, and we have to work to fix it, and we can't just pass campaign promises to freeze the rent and hope that somehow this fixes the affordability crisis.
So look, the mayor has moved his campaign operation into City Hall, spending $2 million of city taxpayer money, your taxpayer money, my taxpayer money, to form an Office of Mass Engagement. And the Office of Mass Engagement's first job is to lobby tenants to testify at the Rent Guidelines Board, say, freeze the rent. Is that a proper use of city funds? And do you think that he should be doing that?
No, and I've been very vocal about this. To me, this is a recognition, again, that the data does not support his rent freeze, and therefore he has to now coalesce tenants to put pressure on his own Rent Guidelines Board to ensure that they deliver his campaign promise of a rent freeze.
So who's going to lobby for the landlords?
You're looking at him.
Yeah, but he has an army of thousands. You're only one guy.
And we're often painted as the powerful real estate industry, but you're pointing out the exact point, right? I mean, I run an organization. We have a very, very smart and intelligent team, but we'll never outnumber the number of tenants in the city. And it's not to be even painted in this picture of like trying to go head to head. There's a world where tenants can absolutely live in quality, dignity housing and live affordably, and property owners can manage their properties. And that is where I'm trying to move the conversation to, as opposed to this binary conversation of every gain that seems to be for property owners comes at the expense of tenants. It doesn't have to be that way.
But every day there are stories about bad landlords. You know that the public advocate has a worst landlords list. And this past week, actually, the mayor had a press conference in the building of one of the worst landlords. And it was in the Bronx and in the Morrisania section. And I went into some of the apartments, and they have to buy their own heaters because there's no heat. There's water leaking out of the ceiling. There's mold in the baseboards and in the bathrooms. So there's, you hear the human stories of people who are living in subhuman conditions, and you say something has to be done. Shouldn't something be done about that?
Absolutely, and this is what I'm speaking to. When you talk about all these stories, a lot of them come from the Bronx, a place that I used to represent in the Assembly. And the reason why we're seeing so much is in the Bronx has the highest concentration of rent stabilization, many times 100% stabilized. I can show you buildings where the average rent roll is $900. Doesn't mean that they have to pay more money, but you have to contend with reality. When the rents are $900, you can't pay for a $300,000 boiler or a $500,000 roof replacement on $900 rent. So when the system is broken in this way, the city has to recognize they are forcing these costs. They want property owners to somehow manage all these costs on $900 rent rolls and offer no assistance, no property tax breaks, no grants. It's impossible. It's impossible. There are nonprofits today that are struggling. They're not as vocal, but they are struggling even without paying property taxes.
But you know, sometimes it's hard to feel sympathy for landlords, and part of the public, because, for example, there was just a story this past week about a suit that was filed by tenants in Crown Heights, who point out that 10 years ago or so, there were, like, say, 52 of the 53 apartments in the building were rent stabilized. But by promising to do repairs and other things, the landlord has managed to take most of the apartments out of rent stabilization so they can charge market rents. And there's only 20 of the original 53 apartments are in the rent stabilized program. They're filing a suit because they say it was done under false pretenses. So did the landlord do something wrong, or do the tenants have a point that, that shouldn't have been done?
I'm not familiar with that case. What I'll say is today there is no path to taking a apartment out of rent stabilization, nor are we advocating for that. Previously, you could, but that was the law. It wasn't a loophole or some sort of attempt to skirt the law. The law allowed for that. But again, this speaks to there is a cost to run housing. At the end of the day, there's a cost to run housing. And if the city wants to bring it down, they have to recognize the cost that they impute to run that housing. I want affordable apartments. I want every New Yorker to live affordably. But we cannot ignore the cost to run this housing in the most expensive city in New York and somehow expect that this housing will be quality. Look at NYCHA. Again, you said Jumaane Williams' worst landlord list. The number one on that list is NYCHA. And we all recognize NYCHA has been underfunded by the federal government. It is a math problem. We make it too emotional, but we have to fix the math.
But, there are people who could say that tenants have a point. I mean, some of them live in difficult conditions.
Absolutely.
And some people could say that landlords have a point because they're being forced to dig into savings sometimes or go into debt, borrow money in order to keep their buildings even operating, forget about making the repairs. So what's the middle ground? What's the solution that a new mayor can justifiably do to protect the interests on both sides?
Well, you just pointed out, right? The tenants are struggling, the property owners are struggling. I think both of those points are true. So who is the common denominator here? It is the government that regulates this housing. The government has to fix its policy.
So is the answer less government regulation?
Not less government regulation. It's better and smarter regulation. The 2019 rent laws cannot be understated in how bad.
So you want the 2019 rent laws repealed?
It's not repealed. You have to take away what's called a vacancy control piece. We're the only rent control system in the country that regulates an empty apartment. If you allow an owner to invest on an empty apartment, protect tenants, the next tenant comes in, enjoys all the benefits of rent stabilization. That's what rent stabilization is. It is a price gouging protection method. It is not a forced affordability without accounting for costs. Allow owners to invest, protect the tenants. They can live there for 10, 20, 30 years, succeed the apartment. But you broke the financing model. Now the entire building is breaking. Now every tenant is suffering because of this system.
But you have a situation where many tenants live in a building for a very long period of time.
Yes.
So then it's impossible for the landlord to get more rent out of it because of rent stabilization. So how are they going to have the money to make the repairs the tenants want?
The simplest way I can put it to you is a building has two budgets, an operating and a capital budget, just like the MTA. The MTA can't fund its infrastructure on $3 fares. But with that promise of revenue, they take out bonds. Owners need to be able to take out bank loans to fund major infrastructure. Again, roofs, boilers. You can't pay for it on rent. But when you break the system on these empty apartments,
so where do they get the money for capital improvements?
From the banks, but you can't get a bank loan. These buildings are underwater in value because of the 2019 rent laws. You can't get a bank loan if there's no path to cover the expenses because of 2019 rent laws.
So how do you want to change those rent laws?
What I'm telling you is in California, they have a rent control system, and what they have is called vacancy reset. After a 10-year tenancy, a 15-year tenancy, at no cost to the city, at no cost to the state, at no cost to any in-place tenant. You allow the owner to invest in a unit, bring it to a first rent with a new tenant.
But it has to be vacant in order to do that.
Of course it does. That's all we're asking for. Vacant in order to do it. You're the new tenant. Marsha, here's your new rent. You now get to stay in this apartment for 20 years if you want, 30 years, and you're protected by rent stabilization. That increases the value of the building. That allows the owner to invest, and it protects the tenants that are currently in place from absorbing increased costs.
So there's no limit as to what the increased rent on the new apartment can be set at?
That's the way you have it in California. It's called a full reset, and that's how you protect the cost for other tenants.
When you were in Albany, did you ever try to introduce legislation
I introduced a bill exactly for this, and it had tenant protections, and I was met with criticisms that I just wanted to increase rent on people when I don't. I want to fix this system. 2.3 million people live in rent stabilization, and if we keep trying to put this populist message pretending we're trying to help them, my former Bronx residents, my former Bronx constituency are still going to see these stories of these buildings crumbling, and they're going to be offered no solutions.
Last question, do you miss Albany?
I miss the camaraderie. It was a great place with a lot of colleagues, people I admire. I don't miss driving up there, though.
I feel your pain. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Marsha.
Thank you at home for joining us as well.